Hello, welcome back. He was a war hero at home, while many in the Arab world considered him a war criminal. And today, as the former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon was buried with full military honours at the family farm, close to the border with the Gaza Strip, the debate about his legacy was as divisive as ever. Mr. Sharon died on Saturday after being in a coma for 8 years. Let's go to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, who joins us from Sderot, where the funeral took place. Lise.
Yes, you join us now in southern Israel, just in front of the final resting place for Ariel Sharon. The end of a very historic day, the end of a life of a man whose own tumultuous life very much reflected the turbulent history of the state of Israel. For some, 85-year-old Ariel Sharon was a war hero. For others, a reckless warrior, and for still others, a war criminal. He was, in every sense, a giant of a man who from the age of 14 fought for the state of Israel, one of the last of Israel's founding generation. And many are now asking whether there are leaders with the kind of authority, credibility and toughness who can carry out the very hard and painful compromises if there is to be a peace with the Palestinians. We'll reflect on the prospects for peace with an Israeli and a Palestinian in just a moment. But first, my colleague Quentin Somerville looks back on the day, starting with the memorial this morning at the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset.
Ariel Sharon's coffin arrived at his beloved Sycamore farm among the rolling hills of southern Israel. It was a time for family grief, but this too was a funeral with full military honours. For Israel, Sharon is one of its greatest battlefield heroes. At an earlier memorial service, he was honoured as a fighter, farmer and statesman, and was part of the country's founding generation.
Your narrative is intertwined in the annals of our state, and you dedicated your life to its life. Your footprints are inscribed in every nook and cranny, hill and valley. You harvested its fruit with a sickle and defended its wheat kernels with a sword.
Whether as a soldier or politician, controversy was never far from Ariel Sharon, but his mission always remained the same.
His strategic objective never wavered. The state, which from the age of 14 he fought to bring into being, had to be protected for future generations.
Ariel Sharon was as much a farmer as a fighter. His connection to Israel's land was visceral, and here on Sycamore Farm, where he spent much of his life, is his final resting place, on a hillside, buried beside his wife, not far from Gaza. And the risk of missile attacks from Gaza meant warning sirens were placed around the burial site. Palestinians have been celebrating, not mourning his passing. For them, he remains a warmonger, not a war hero. His journey here to his final resting place carried him past the scene of his earliest battles. Controversial to the end, Israel and Ariel Sharon travelled through history together.
Today was a day of solemn ceremony and exceptional security. Rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip just a few kilometres from here, hours before the start of Ariel Sharon's funeral. And after it ended, 2 more rockets were fired into this area as well, underlining again, if it needed underlining, that these are 2 peoples yet to make peace. But is it possible? We're joined now from Ramallah on the West Bank by the veteran Palestinian politician Hanan Ashrawi of the Palestinian Legislative Council, and from Jerusalem by Dani, Dayan, also a political activist and the foreign envoy for the Settler Council known as the Yesha Council. Welcome to both of you. And if I could start with you, Dani, Dayan, some of the Israeli newspapers are saying today that if Ariel Sharon had lived, he would have disengaged also from the West Bank. Do you think that a disengagement, even a future Palestinian state, is on the cards?
Very similar lines, don't you?
No, I don't think so. I think that he would have learned from his mistake. Look, Ariel Sharon, his entire life, wanted to grant Israel, the Israeli citizens, security and peace. He succeeded to grant that security after the horrendous terrorist attack in the Passover celebration in 2003, when he at last launched a operation to give us security, but when he tried to give us peace, he was not reciprocated by the Palestinians. The Palestinians could have established in the Gaza Strip the Singapore of the Middle East. Instead of that, they make a decision to convert the Gaza Strip into a mini Somalia, a terrorist state that its whole purpose is to be a launching pad for an aggression against Israel. Therefore, I am sure that Ariel Sharon would have learned the lesson from his mistake and would have not done the same thing in Judea and Samaria.
But do you think that Israel now under Netanyahu can make a peace deal?
Well, Israel is willing to make a peace deal. The problem is that, again, for the 10th or 12th time in history, the Palestinians do not reciprocate. The Palestinians refuse to recognize Israel, the most basic thing, as the national home of the Jewish people. As a matter of fact, they refuse to recognize the existence of a Jewish nation that has roots in this land. So under those circumstances, when for 65 years they keep using the refugees, not the refugees as a matter of fact, the descendants, the fifth generation, as a bargaining chip, living in squalid conditions in order to prevent an agreement, then how can we agree? You need two to tango, Liz.
Well, let's bring in Hanan Ashrawi. Hanan Ashrawi, as you know, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is trying to bring Israelis and Palestinians to a framework deal, if not a final peace deal. Do you think it will happen this time?
I think it's extremely difficult if such a deal includes Israeli ideological preferences, like this new additional precondition of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, having recognized it in 1993. I think they should ask the whole world to re-recognize Israel or change her name, number one. Number two, if the U.S. allows for continued Israeli impunity, use of violence, continued annexation of land, the theft of our land, and the annexation of Jerusalem and transformation of Jerusalem and the building of settlements. If Israel continues with these violations, no peace agreement can incorporate not just such blatant illegalities, but also such an injustice that will create even further violence. The thing is, do we want to end the occupation? Do we want to have Israel comply with international law and the requirements of peace? Or is this just another exercise to buy more time for Israeli unilateralism and violence, which of course Sharon was the greatest symbol for, having used it all his life on the basis of power politics. When you have 46 years of impunity, of violence, of control, of power politics without any accountability or intervention, the only way to have real peace is to undo all these issues that lead to violence and instability. And therefore, I think unless the U.S. is willing to exhibit the courage and the political will to stand up to Israel and to bring it to compliance, it'll be extremely difficult.
Courage and political will, that's it's being said, is needed by leaders and by peoples on both sides. I'm sorry, we don't have more time to continue this debate, but Hanan Ashrawi in Ramallah, Dani, Dayan in Jerusalem, the world, and indeed Israelis and Palestinians will be watching in the months to come. And that's all from us here in southern Israel.
Lise, thank you very much.